evening, comrades. You know, today is the day we honor, the week we honor great martyrs like Martin Luther King, Patrice Lumumba, who was murdered on January 17th, and so many wonderful people that we know have died recently. Amiri Baraka, our comrade Dave Schechter, a Jewish communist from Yonkers who was on the front lines always in the fight against racism, all forms of racism, including Zionism. Comrade Milton Vera, that wonderful Puerto Rican revolutionary from communist from the Bronx, who was also on the front lines of so many struggles for over so many years. My mother, Juanita, who died 4 weeks ago. They are all honored this week in Workers' World newspaper, but you will not find them honored in the capitalist, monopoly capitalist news media. No politicians came to their funerals. Most will not know their names, just as few know the names of the 27 Palestinians murdered last year by Israeli soldiers, because just like hardly a week goes by in the United States, or even a few days, without cops murdering and oppressing a black or Latino young man or woman, not a week goes by in Palestine without Israeli troops or settlers murdering somebody. We don't know the names of those who died, of the Palestinians starving to death now in the Yarmouk camp, in the horrible situation in Syria created by U.S. imperialism. We don't know the names of those who are dying in the terror bombings in Lebanon. But I am not here. All of these people died too young, even my mother, who was 88. But I'm not here tonight to talk about someone who died too young. I'm here to talk about someone who lived way too long. Not someone like my mother, but someone more like General Andrew Jackson, who deported her ancestors to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. The imperialist politicians from around the world flocked to his funeral, the funeral of Ariel Sharon, the butcher of Beirut, a man, one of the most vicious war criminals of the 20th century, and a war profiteer as well. The longest talk at his funeral was given by U.S. Vice President Joe Biden, liberal Joe Biden, who led a delegation of Congresspeople, including New York's Eliot Engel, to honor this right-wing mass murderer. Upon his return from Palestine, from occupied Palestine, Biden went to Detroit, where he spoke yesterday at the auto show. Maybe Detroit, maybe the people of Detroit could use some of the billions the United States gives to Israel every year. But that will not happen. This depressed and plundered city will not get that aid without a massive struggle, because just the very same banks, the government of this country is the government of the bankers. And the very same bankers who loot Detroit, who plunder Detroit, Israel is their tool in the Arab world, in the Middle East. They honored him because he did them good service. He was their hitman, and they paid him well. And when I say that the they I'm talking about are the Pentagon generals, the Wall Street bankers, the giant oil monopolies, the military contractors, and the politicians, Republican and Democratic, who serve them. Every crime, every war, every massacre carried out by Ariel Sharon and the State of Israel brought money into their coffers, helped to keep the oil wealth of the Arab world flowing into the vaults of the banks of Wall Street. That is why the apartheid State of Israel gets more aid, absolutely and per capita, than any other country in the world. Ariel Sharon's parents, Ariel Sharon's life, the Israeli nickname Ariel, is the story of the State of Israel, and it's also the story of the Palestinian Nakba, which is going on to this day, the exile of the Palestinian people from their homeland. Sharon's parents were two emigres from the Soviet Union who left there in 1922 because they didn't like the revolution. Apparently they didn't mind the Tsar. Sharon was born on a Zionist settlement in Palestine in 1922 and grew up there under the British mandate. What is Zionism? Zionism is a racist and colonialist movement that was founded in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. While heroic Jewish workers and peasants were on the front lines of the struggle for socialist revolution in Europe and here in the United States as well, the Zionists believed that the solution to the oppression of Jewish people in Europe was to sell themselves as mercenaries to the anti-Semitic and imperialist ruling classes of Europe, their own oppressors. You give us some land, a piece of land, maybe not Palestine, maybe Uganda, maybe somewhere in North Africa. You give us land in one of your colonies in Asia or Africa, and we will be your best soldiers. After World War II, when Britain and France carved up the Arab world and its oil between them, Britain opened the land of Palestine to Zionist settlement as an excuse to betray the promise of independence it had made to the Arab people. For Britain, Palestine was the gateway through which the oil of Iraq, the stolen oil of Iraq, could go through the port of Haifa to the markets of Europe and to British ships there in the Mediterranean, as well as a military base. The outlook of the Zionist movement was summed up by Ariel Sharon's political mentor and idol, another Russian emigre named Vladimir Jabotinsky, who said, "Should Palestine remain Arab, Palestine would follow the orbit of Arab destinies, the federation of Arab countries and elimination of all European influence. But a Palestine as a Jewish state will always seek to lean on some powerful empire, non-Arab and non-Muslim." We actually said Mohammedan, but that's an offensive term. And this is an almost providential basis for a permanent alliance between England and a Jewish, but only a Jewish Palestine. That was the outlook of the Zionist movement. And if you substitute the words United States for England or Britain, it's the same relationship that exists today. Sharon would have been 8 years old when the Arab people of Palestine rose up against British rule in an earth-shaking insurrection that tied down 1/3 of the British Army and saw some of the first use of aircraft to bomb civilians. And the British also trained the Zionist militia, armed and trained the Zionist militia, the Haganah, to protect the oil pipeline that ran from Iraq to the port of Haifa. Whenever Arab guerrillas would attack the oil pipeline, the Haganah would blow up and destroy the nearest Arab village in collective punishment. That was the roots of the Israeli army. Sharon joined the Haganah as a teenager, and by 1947 began taking part in terrorist raids on Arab villages. Beginning with that was the war that began with the partition of Palestine in 1947, imposed on Palestine by the United Nations at the demand of the Truman administration, when most countries in the Arab world, in Africa and Asia, were still colonies. And it's called in history books here, and where we're taught, the Israeli War of Independence. It was a Holocaust. It was an ethnic cleansing. 400 villages were wiped off the map. Thousands of people were massacred. Hundreds of thousands of people were marched from their homes at gunpoint, and barrels of dynamite and gasoline were rolled into urban neighborhoods to force the people to leave. That's how the State of Israel was created. After the ceasefire of 1949, when the war ended in the ceasefire of 49, most of Palestine was part of the Israeli occupation state. The West Bank was controlled by the Jordanian army. Gaza was controlled by Egypt. And hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, the majority of the people of Palestine, were living in tents, refugee camps across the border. And some tried to return peacefully at first. Some just tried to come back to their land. They thought the war was over, they could come. Or maybe they came at night to try to pick some crops, and they were shot down by the Israeli army, or imprisoned by the Jordanians, who had made a deal with Israel. The majority of Palestinian people did not accept the deal King Abdullah of Jordan made with Israel, and they eventually began a guerrilla resistance across the border. This was I'm talking late 40s now, early 50s. And Israel's response was the same as that of Adolf Hitler: collective punishment, collective retaliation. And the man who got the job was Ariel Sharon. He formed something called Unit 101. Its code name was Retribution. And whenever there was a Palestinian guerrilla attack across the border, they would hit an Arab village. And most famously, in October of 1953, they went to the village of Kibbutz on the West Bank, and they dynamited 49 houses, killing 75 to 80, mostly old people, women, and children. Sharon was involved in 8 terrorist raids against in the next few years, major terrorist operations against Syria or Jordan or Egypt. Some of them even embarrassed the Israeli state. By the way, I want to say during the war, the so-called War of Independence, I'll return to that later, actually. In 1956, The new revolutionary government of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. This canal had been built. 100,000 Egyptian workers died building this canal that ran through Egypt. It was owned by an Anglo-French corporation. So when the Egyptians did that, Britain and France invaded Egypt, and Israel joined in. And they seized the Sinai Peninsula, and Sharon, his role in that was a operation in which several hundred captured Egyptian prisoners of war and Sudanese prisoners of war, both soldiers and civilian workers, were murdered, or shot after being captured. After the Israelis withdrew, mass graves were found in Gaza and in the Sinai. There was kind of a struggle between the U.S. and Israel at that time. See, even when there's a rift, they're doing U.S. imperialism a good service, because the U.S. didn't really want Britain and France to take back over the region. They wanted to be the big force in the region. But also there was the question of the growing, that more and more people in the Arab world were looking east, were looking to the Soviet Union, were looking to revolutionary China. And Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, threatened to rain missiles on Paris and London and Tel Aviv if Israel and Britain and France did not withdraw from Egypt. And it was in that climate that the U.S., that Eisenhower ordered Israel to withdraw, and they did. In 1967, Israel seized the rest of Palestine. It was called the Second Nakba. They seized the West Bank and Gaza. Sharon was involved in an operation against Jerusalem. And this war was a great service to the United States, to Wall Street, because it shifted the balance in the Arab world against the nationalist regimes in Syria and Egypt, and in favor of the royal families of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, who were basically front men for the U.S. oil companies. In 1973, and this is when Sharon really rose to fame, Egypt and Syria, in a brilliant operation, tried to take back their land in Sinai and the Golan Heights. But when Israel also occupied the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, I wish I had a map here, and the Golan Heights in Syria, they tried to pick there was a brilliant operation crossing of the Suez Canal by the Egyptian army led by General Ahmed Shasli. They took the Israelis by surprise. They captured this supposedly invincible Israeli army, and they used missiles to defeat Israel's air superiority. Sharon is credited with saving the war for Israel because he led a counterattack, his tank brigade. You know, he was a good general, tank commander like Erwin Rommel, and he crossed the Suez Canal and snaked behind the Egyptian army, but he was stopped. And Comrade Fred wrote an article about this, I remember at the time, in Workers' World newspaper, on the outskirts of the Egyptian city of Ismailia by an armed people's militia. But this Israel's turning the war around owes more to the fact that Israel had complete satellite intelligence from the United States and was saved by the largest U.S. military airlift in history, ordered by Richard Nixon. I'm sorry, the largest military airlift in history of arms. And Israeli defense minister at the time, Moshe Dayan, said, the shells we fire in the Sinai in the afternoon arrive from the United States in the morning. Also, Nixon actually brought the United States to nuclear alert, risked nuclear war to prevent any kind of Soviet help from coming to Egypt and Syria. Okay, sorry. In the 70s, Sharon was out of the government for a while, but he did other things. In private life, he was a plantation owner in the Negev desert. He owned a watermelon plantation. Palestine has always been famous for fruit, for bananas, for oranges, for lemons, for watermelon, long before the Zionist settlers came and supposedly made the desert bloom. And his plantation was worked by workers from Gaza, from the occupied Gaza, people who had once lived on that land but could now only return in the daytime as farm laborers or construction laborers, and had to be back in Gaza by nightfall. Or go to jail. You know, it's like the signs they used to have in southern towns, you know, telling black people, don't be in town after sundown. But he also, in the 70s, created a massive arms network of supplying Israeli arms to Central America. And this was I'll get back to this later, he's a great service to the United States, because basically Israel has a huge arms industry. And But if you go, I mean, when I was there, all the arms I saw Israeli soldiers carrying were M16s. What happens is the arms Israel produces. They went to countries that the United States was embarrassed, politically unable to arm openly, like apartheid South Africa, like the white settler regime in Rhodesia, like some of the death squad regimes in Central America, like Pinochet's Chile, like Duvalier's Haiti. They all got Israeli arms because popular opinion would not allow the U.S. to sell them arms directly. So the U.S. supplied arms to Israel for free, and Israel sold its arms to these dictatorships that therefore killing like 3 birds with 1 stone. In 1980, Sharon became defense minister, and in 1982 launched Operation Peace for Galilee. It was called the invasion of Lebanon, an attempt to destroy after the '67 war. There had been a huge resurgence of the Palestinian armed liberation movement when people saw the Arab governments were not going to do it for them, and the growth of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Operation Peace for Galilee. You know, it shows, you know, at one time military operations were made to conceal their purpose, like Operation Overlord, you're not supposed to, with the D-Day, you're not supposed to know what that means. Now, it's obvious when a country calls it an operation by something that describes its alleged purpose, you know, that it's a political rather than an operational necessity. Anyway, this was a bloody invasion where they leveled city after city and refugee camp after refugee camp in Lebanon, finally to surrounding Beirut, where West Beirut, the Muslim part of Beirut, was destroyed, reduced to rubble by Israeli artillery and by the latest weapons supplied by the United States, weapons that were provided to no other country outside of the U.S. Armed Forces, like the fuel air explosives, concussion bombs, the vacuum bombs, the most powerful non-atomic explosive bomb around. But his greatest notoriety came, the Israelis had surrounded Beirut. The U.S., Britain, the UN, the Soviet Union intervened to try to find a solution, and the Palestinian fighters were evacuated from Beirut by U.S. The United States was afraid of the consequences globally and across the region if Israel were to actually seize Beirut. The fighters were evacuated to Tunisia in a deal in which the international forces and the multinational force, which included mostly the U.S., Britain, and France, promised to protect the Palestinian refugee camps. Israel's main ally in Lebanon was the 2 fascist movements, Christian fanatic movements, based in the Maronite community. One was called the Kataib, or the Phalange, named after Franco's party in Spain. The other was called the Lebanese Forces. They imposed the head of the Falangist party, the Christian minority party, as the president of Lebanon. He was killed by a bomb, and 2 nights later, the Israelis cordoned off the largest refugee camp in Beirut. They blocked anyone from leaving. They shined bright searchlights into the camp from neighboring buildings, and they sent up illumination flares, making, as witnesses have said, it as bright as day when the Falangist militia went in with guns and knives and went to work. The fighters were gone, the young men were gone. They killed up to 3,500 older people, women and children in the camp, and they're buried in mass graves. The pictures are horrific. You can find them online under Sabra and Shatila. I was there in 2009. It's a field of grass where goats graze, and under there are the remains of over 3,000 people. This was a time when the United States still had to contend with the USSR in international politics, and there was some embarrassment about it. Sharon actually resigned as defense minister, but before that, there was a supposed rift between the U.S. and Israel that was phony because the U.S. paid for the whole invasion. And what Sharon did, though, when this rift was supposedly in progress, he went to Honduras and he arranged that all the arms, the Soviet-made arms the Israelis had captured in Lebanon, be shipped to Nicaragua to arm the Contras. Israel actually played as deep a role in the Contra War in Nicaragua, in the death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador, as the United States did. And of course, it was all on Washington's behalf. That's one of the services that Israel does for the United States, for U.S. imperialism. Sharon returned, was never really out of the government, and he was made prime minister in 2000. And then he gained fame. They call him a peacemaker because in 2000, a few years later, he withdrew Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. Gaza is the biggest prison on earth. It's a few miles south of Tel Aviv. You know, Sharon and myself and some other comrades were there in 2009 after the war with the Viva Palestina aid convoy, and comrades from LA, John Parker and Judy Greenspan. The people who live there in this, the most crowded square miles on earth is the Jabalia camp. There are people who used to live in the Israeli cities of Tel Aviv, and they're now living in this giant prison surrounded by iron walls. And so Sharon, the Israelis withdrew from Gaza to reduce the cost of occupation and, you know, stop their soldiers from being killed. It was a vulnerable situation, but they maintained it as a prison. And when the Palestinian people democratically elected Hamas to be their representative, they imposed a blockade in collaboration with the Egyptian Camp David government that continues to this day. And they have turned Gaza into hell on earth. There were a couple of 100,000 Israeli settlers, so-called, mostly from the United States, living in Gaza, living right by the refugee camps, living in split-level homes while people in the camps have to line up to get water in buckets. They had sprinklers watering the lawns. It was like being on Long Island. And they were angry about having to give up their land in Gaza. So the United States government gave each settler family $600,000, free and clear, to relocate to the West Bank. This is the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I don't want to be entirely negative about Ariel Sharon. His last 8 years were lived very well. He stayed in a hospital bed and didn't bother anybody. But his state continued to wage war. In Lebanon in 2006, I'm just sorry he was not conscious to see Israel suffer its first military defeat at the hands of the Lebanese resistance and Hezbollah, a defeat they're trying to avenge now in the terror campaign against Syria. They attacked Gaza twice in 2009 and again in 2012. And, you know, the same latest U.S. weapons, the dense inert metal explosives, things have never been deployed before, used to cut children in half and things like that. That's what they... And Israel will continue. Sharon was gone, but Sharon was just a tool, and the state of Israel is just a tool. It will continue to behave the way it does as long as it remains a racist apartheid settler state, and as long as it continues to be armed to the teeth with an endless flow of weapons from its U.S. imperialist paymaster. When we fight, the fight to free Palestine is not only a fight for real peace in the Middle East, it's the fight against the same bankers who are plundering Detroit. It's the fight against the same racist system we face here, because nothing is more crucial to the power of Wall Street and the oil companies than control of the oil of the Middle East and the protection racket, the highly lucrative protection racket they run there. And Israel is a key part of that. But with all these nearly 60-plus years of terror and atrocities, they have not been able to stop the struggle of the Palestinian people. The battle rages every day on the West Bank, in Gaza. And now they have a plan called the Proa Plan to evict the Bedouin remaining in the Negev Desert in southern Israel from their homes to create settler-only housing. Even so, with all their military achievements, they are desperate, and we have to make the struggle of free Palestine an integral part of the people's movement and the anti-war movement here. And also, one other thing, this January 12th marks the anniversary of the arrest of Ahmed Sadat, one of the world's most important political prisoners, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and we also call for his freedom. Thank you. I mentioned Nelson Mandela, another great martyr who died last month, and Nelson Mandela said that apartheid in Palestine was worse than what happened in South Africa. And when we were, comrades Sharon and Johnny, myself, Andre Powell, Bill Bateman were in South Africa in 2001 for the World Conference on Racism, the feeling that the people of South Africa have for Palestine was overwhelming. And it's understandable, too. It's not only solidarity against two so similar oppressions, but Israel was the main armorer of the apartheid regime. They made their Israeli weapons under license, and then the U.S. was the armorer of Israel. It was, this one scratches that, you know. But I do want to stress that the Zionist lobby, which exists, the American Israeli Political Affairs Committee, terrible bunch of people as they are, is not the driving force behind U.S. support of Israel. It's imperialism. And imperialism is the rule of the banks, and that's big capital. The oil companies, the arms, the military-industrial complex, the banks who are behind all of them, and most of the owners of big capital are still happen to be Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Doesn't really matter. Even if they're Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever, a capitalist operates for the highest return on their capital, not for, and that's the driving force of their system. And that's what, and right now that system has nothing to offer in the Middle East, as we can see in Syria, in Iraq, in the horrible, dangerous situation happening in Lebanon, in the continuing daily atrocities in Palestine. It has nothing to offer that part of the world but sectarian war. You know, it started with Palestine, and now through the agency of Saudi Arabia, they're spreading it across the region. Well, we can go across Africa and across the world. Just two examples of the role. When Sharon invaded Lebanon, you know, the U.S.-Israeli war against Lebanon in '82, the stocks of Grumman and General Dynamics shot through the roof. Now, General Dynamics spends twice as much on lobbying every year as AIPAC does. This one company. And Syria had tried to come to the help. Contrary to the lies, a lot of anti-Syrian propaganda, hundreds of Syrian soldiers died in that war. Syria tried to send air support to the Palestinians, and the Syrian planes were destroyed on the runway as they were taking off because Israel had the most modern AWACS systems, just the same ones that were supplied to the U.S. military. And I was working at Fortune magazine at the time, and I remember the articles raving about how U.S. aerospace stocks were going through the roof because every time Israel deploys a new weapon system, it's a big sales operation for the U.S. military-industrial complex. And as far as I do want to mention one other capitalist as an example. His name is Henry Zweika. He is Jewish. He's a Zionist. He got it rich in hedge funds. And he's a major funder of the right-wing settlers in Palestine, has close ties to the Likud party and the Israeli government. And his hedge fund made a lot of money in oil speculation. And what affects the price of oil more than anything else is war in the Middle East. If you know what Israel is going to do tomorrow, you know what's going to happen to the oil futures. And in 2004, after having made a bundle on the Iraq War, he sold his hedge fund to J.P. Morgan Stanley. You know, it's follow the dollar. It's I'm sorry. I know we're late, but when Sharon's artillery was shelling Beirut in 1982, they leveled West Beirut with the U.S. weapons, and one of the buildings they destroyed was the only synagogue remaining in was the only synagogue in Lebanon. Was destroyed by Israeli artillery. In 2006, after the Lebanese resistance defeated Israel's incursion, a new synagogue was built in central Beirut with the support of Hezbollah.